It has been said that football is a sport played by gentlemen, watched by hooligans, and that rugby is a sport played by hooligans and watched by gentlemen. And this little phrase is so pithy that it almost feels true. But there's one little element that seems to undermine that theory, and that's the fact that I've observed a fairly large number of rugby players who have played at the international level exiting rugby in order to take up the rather delicate and nuanced art of winemaking, which is hardly hooliganish behavior. First of all, France gave us Gérard Bertrand, who has now been crowned pretty much emperor of biodynamics around the world, and rightly so, as he owns and runs the largest biodynamic operation in the world. He has 16 estates, all of which are Demeter certified. Then there is Bismarck du Plessis and Yanni du Plessis, who own a business called Rugby Field Vineyards, and this revolves around the idea of having vineyards the exact size of a rugby field in a number of wine-producing countries. They have an old vine Syrah vineyard in France, they have some Chenin and Pinotage in Stellenbosch, and there are plans afoot, allegedly, to have a vineyard in New Zealand as well. And Scotland get in on the act, and it's Doddy Weir, who teamed up with South Africa's Skalkberger in order to produce a wine called Number 5, and that fruit came from Skalkberger's family estate in Wellington. And if we go back to France, there's Olivier Brusier, the French lock forward, who went and bought an entire Chateau Haute-Francarnie in the Canon-Fronsac appellation. And even Australia tried to throw their hat in the ring because Bruce Tyrrell once said that he dreamed of playing rugby for Australia. Tell him he's dreaming. But a knee injury put spanners to those plans and he had to go into winemaking. Although the world might argue that it is a better place for having one more bottle of VAT number 1 Semillon than it is to have another muddied Wallaby jersey. But for all the examples that I've given you, I think there is one man that stands above all of those, a man who has made history and changed the shape both of the sport of rugby and also the wine industry at large, and that is Jan Boland Coetzee. He is a man who has ploughed vineyards as often as he's ploughed through all black backlines and has single-handedly shaped Stellenbosch Cabernet, and this is why today's Hand Drink Solo Curious Wine of the day is a tribute to him. And that wine is the Vriesenhof Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon 2023. Not to be confused with the main range Cabernet from Vriesenhof, which has been around for years. And at this point you might ask, well, why on earth is the Reserve Cabernet only being released now, given that it is from Vriesenhof, an estate that was owned by Jan Boland Coetzee when he was alive, who was Mr. Cabernet in Stellenbosch? They should have had a reserve wine yonks ago. And I guess the short answer is that really, to produce a wine that is worthy of being a tribute to a man like Jan Boland Coetzee takes a hell of a lot of time in the vineyards, in the cellar. And this particular wine was made by winemaker Adam Mason, who himself is a bit of a Stellenbosch legend. He's worked with estates like De Morganson and Milderbosch, and he has his own range raised by wolves. And he had the task of not only selecting the sites where he would source the fruit for the wine, but then also doing a number of micro fermentations and experimentations with various barrels in the cellar, because it was crucial for him to make sure that the right Cooper was producing the right barrel in order to suit the incredible fruit that they had managed to glean from the vineyards in which the viticultural team at Vriesenhof had worked so hard. So really a lot of work went into elevating the wine. But before we talk about the wine, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the man Jan Boland Coetzee. There is a huge amount of material online about this man, and I couldn't possibly talk about everything that he's done or what he's been through, but I will leave a link to an incredible article written by historian and wine journalist Emile Joubert, who really does a great job of going into the nitty-gritty of who the man was and what he did. But there were a couple of things that I found either impressive or amusing that I thought I would share with you. And the first was his nickname, Boland. Now, as a schoolboy, Jan Coetzee was selected to play rugby for Boland, and for that he received a blazer, Boland colours. Now, being a West Coast farm kid, that was the only blazer that he ever owned. And so when he arrived at Stellenbosch University, every time there was a formal occasion that required a blazer, out came the Boland colours. Guest lecturer, Boland blazer. Formal dinner, Boland blazer. First date, Boland blazer. So it's unsurprisingly that shouts of "Da hat Boland" became rather common in Stellenbosch, although if he'd been at UCT, it would have been more along the lines of "Hey Boland, my boy." Perhaps what's most interesting about the nickname is that it seems to have inextricably fused itself into his name, in the sense that even when it's abbreviated, it has the B, JBC. In fact, is Jan Coetzee even a thing without having Boland in the middle? Seems kind of hollow. The next thing that impressed me about Jan Boland Coetzee was his untiring, ceaseless work ethic. At one point in his life, he was waking up before dawn in order to tend the vineyards at the Stellenbosch estate of Kanonkorp, which is really an estate that he put on the map through various decisions. He then would handle a 1,200-ton harvest with a fairly small team of 70 labourers, and he would then get in his car at the end of the day, drive roughly 40 minutes through to Cape Town in order to play rugby for Western Province, and then drive 40 minutes back to Stellenbosch before going to bed and waking up the next morning to do it all over again. In fact, in order to handle this schedule, he was famous for his little cat naps that he'd take on the bench in the change rooms at the Western Province Stadium, and he got mocked for it by teammates at the time, but current sleep science would say that was absolute elite tier micro recovery. Perhaps the next element I found impressive was not only his vision, but also his ability to respond to his gut feel in the absence of perhaps any hard scientific soil data, for example. When he arrived at Kanonkorp and looked at a whole bunch of Shiraz vineyards planted in gravel soil, he thought, those have to go. This is Cabernet soil. And so he almost unilaterally ripped up the Shiraz, which made the owners a little nervous at the time, and then planted Cabernet. Although for a man who was so headstrong and firm in his decisions, it was quite comical to have a neighbour pass by the next day to ask him whether he planted the vineyards by moonlight because the rows were the skewest thing he'd ever seen. And so, embarrassed by his agricultural faux pas, from that point onwards, he would always stand at the edge of a field with a hunting rifle and shoot a series of holes in a straight line to make sure that his vines ended up straight. And the final point I want to share about Jan is perhaps one that seems contrary to all the rest, to a strong physical man with gut instinct and firm decisions and an incredible work ethic. He seemed very serious, all work and no play. And yet, there is a lovely story about the first time he sampled the 1973 Kanonkorp Cabernet Sauvignon. And when he tasted that wine, he immediately called his friend from a neighboring estate, Akim van Arnhem, and together they tasted the sample and danced around the cellar like madmen. And I love the idea of this massive, brooding hulk of a man with a vision and a purpose who also has time to dance with joy at the taste of some wine. So now that we know about the man, let's get into the glass and see what Adam Mason has prepared for us as tribute. When we give this wine a sniff, oh man, well, it is so brooding. It feels a little bit like Christian Bale as Batman. It's just this dark, hulking, almost grumpy, and yet despite all that, you still kind of want to draw closer. And when you do, well, you get these beautiful bursts of classic Stellenbosch Cassis, which is just, it's such a telltale sign of a great Stellenbosch Cabernet. It's these very clear, concise Cassis/black currant notes. Then there's also a beautiful, clear herbal fennel note to it. And then flowing around all that, you have things like cocoa dust and cedar wood and a touch of kirsch, almost like a cherry liqueur, black cherry skin thing going on in there. Over, above, and beyond all those elements, there's this beautiful, almost like a roasted cherry pie crust, which I guess is probably a little bit of a mix of some cinnamon, touches of vanilla and nutmeg, all from the oak, but just beautifully integrated with the fruit. So when we give this guy a sip and see what's on the palate, the concentration is unbelievable. That fennel note on the nose is now full-blown licorice, and woven in between the blackcurrant and the licorice, you have roasted plum, that savory plum skins, even a touch of blueberry. But it is just so immense, the concentration of this fruit, that you hardly notice these rather firm tannins around the edges. And that really is because the balance is delightful. That big fruit down the middle fits perfectly in with the firm tannins that hold it in place. And the weird things about these New World big icon-style Cabernet Sauvignon wines is that they're often associated with being jammy or confected, or that the fruit has somehow lost purity. And yet this particular one is undeniably savory, bringing on those kind of almost umami roasted plum skin type elements. It has a little bit of that Maillard reaction warmth to it. The tail is, of course, no slouch either, and it lingers beautifully. That concentrated fruit is not just a burst up front, but lasts right through the wine. And so at the end, you're left with this pure cassis intermingled with touches of that oak spice, that cinnamon, a little bit of licorice. I guess if I summed it up, it's a wine that manages to be ripe without being sweet, and it manages to be powerful without being heavy. So while you pour yourself most likely the rest of the bottle, I'm going to leave you links to 2 videos, one of which talks about South African Cabernet coming out of Walker Bay. of all places, which is traditionally Pinot Noir territory. And the other video is about a Cabernet Sauvignon made by Rudy Schultz, one of Stellenbosch's stalwart winemakers and longtime winemaking hero at the estate of Thelema. Until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.